In 2022, Counterweight, the organization that Helen Pluckrose founded and that was absorbed into the Institute for Liberal Values, had a virtual conference on liberal approaches to diversity and inclusion. Starting in 2025, we will be rolling out one talk a month that was presented at the conference. We sit down with the original presenters throughout 2025 to see what has changed since 2022. With diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives seemingly on the chopping block, we are curious to hear what our original participants are witnessing and experiencing on the ground. Is DEI really dead or just in remission? Are there healthy alternatives to DEI that we should consider? Or do we throw the baby out with the bathwater and wipe our hands clean? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. This month, we share Lyell Asher's original presentation to the conference on DEI hacks. You can find our podcast where we check in with him in the present day to find out how things have changed, entitled For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Death of Knowledge, in the show notes. Lyell Asher, welcome to the Counterweight Conference, Liberal Approaches to Diversity and Inclusion. It is awesome to have you here. And for our audience, Lyell, you are a professor at Lewis and Clark College. You are also the mastermind, if you will, the voice behind why colleges are becoming cults on YouTube. And you also wrote a really seminal piece in Collect called How Ed Schools Became a Menace to Higher Education.
Yes.
And a lot of what you've done has changed the way I think about things. And I feel like you're going to share quite a bit of that with us today. So I will, with that, let you have the floor. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here. So the title of my talk today is Diversity and Inclusion Hacks. That's HACKS. And since the word hack is ambiguous, I should probably make it clear that I'm not explicitly referring to diversity and inclusion bureaucrats as hacks, though that may be an implicit meaning that some of you will take away from my talk. The meaning of hack that I do intend is the sense of, modifying something on the cheap in order to make it work better. And I want to show how easy and I hope instructive it is to take material from existing diversity and inclusion programs and improve them. And the only tool you'll need for this kind of hacking is the ability and willingness to answer questions and ask questions. So I'm going to give you two examples of existing programs that you can look at and then use for your own purposes. Now, you don't have to have access to these programs or these texts, as one of the programs that I'm referring to is actually an essay, a very famous essay. But I just want to show you the kind of thing that you could do to actually do what diversity and inclusion claims to be doing, but so often isn't, okay? So my first example of a hackable program really comes from a diversity and inclusion training module that I was required to take online a couple of years ago. I'm sure it's familiar to many people, but in case it isn't, this kind of training consists of watching dramatizations of workplace interactions and then answering questions about them. And if you know anything about these programs, you also know that the scenarios are somewhat predictable and the answers to the questions they ask are fairly obvious. And when I say obvious, I just mean that it's clear how the authors of the program expect you to respond. So one scenario did stand out, though, for at least raising an issue that I think is genuinely complex. And I was surprised that he was on the program. I'm sure it's been taken off by now. But this scenario involved a man, I'll call him Jamal. He wasn't given a name in the video. But he's at the beginning of a business meeting and he refuses to shake hands with a new female employee named Rachel. As Rachel extends her hand, Jamal smiles warmly and bows slightly, but he declines to reciprocate the handshake. And the camera then focuses, on Rachel's face, and she's clearly bothered by this and maybe vaguely offended. And then the screen fades to black. And then the next scene we see is Rachel in the Human Resources office, and she's talking to the head of HR, and I'll call her Heather. And Heather is letting Rachel know that she shouldn't be offended by Jamal's behavior because Jamal is Muslim, who considers it improper to have physical contact with members of the opposite sex beyond the members of his own family. So in the video, Rachel is just, perfectly relieved to hear this. Thanks, Heather, for the information. And she leaves the office a happy employee, and the screen again fades to black. And then a sentence appeared on the screen that's supposed to be the moral of the story, which is, and I'm quoting, well, not quite verbatim, but this is how I remember it. Shaking hands and making physical contact during personal introductions is not the norm in many cultures and traditions. There were really no questions asked about this particular scenario. It was just given as a way of behaving, and that's the way everyone should behave when confronted with this. So I think I can muster 2 cheers for whoever it was that decided to at least include the scenario, to the extent that at least, approaches some of the complexities involved in what's called diversity and inclusion. But in the end, it approaches the complexities only to erase them by pretending that there's a clear answer to this problem. So here's where the hacking comes in. And this is something that you could do almost with any scenario that a diversity and inclusion program gives you. And I don't pretend, by the way, that this is any revolutionary idea. I'm just saying this is what a diversity and inclusion program ought to be doing. And since it does it, you can do it. So we just have to ask ourselves, what might Rachel have said if she wasn't entirely satisfied with the head of HR, Heather, with Heather's response? In fact, what if Rachel had said in her meeting with HR, okay, but I'm still discriminated against because of my sex. I'm not being extended the same courtesy that a man is, so why does it matter that it's a religious belief that is motivating this discriminatory behavior? Then Heather from HR responds by saying, well, to be inclusive, Rachel, we have to accommodate religious practices that we may not agree with. That's what being inclusive means. Then Rachel says, what if that religious practice is itself exclusionary? What if Jamal's religious beliefs had prevented him from shaking hands with someone, let's say, from a different racial group, which his religion considers inferior or contemptible? Would that be tolerated? Heather then says, no, but as I understand it, Jamal isn't refusing to shake your hand because he considers you inferior or contemptible. It's because you're not in his immediate family. Muslim women will often refuse to shake hands of men who are not in their immediate family for the same reason. That doesn't mean they think men are inferior or contemptible. But Rachel has something else to say. So she says, but behind all of this, Heather, stands an assumption that what distinguishes women from men is their sexual allure. And this assumption inevitably leads to restrictions being imposed on women, not on men, which is why women are hidden behind burqas and locked behind walls, not men. Well, says Heather, when Jamal tries to make you wear a burqa or put you behind a wall, we can speak to him. For now, though, I don't think we can insist that he shake your hand if he doesn't want to. Okay, so if I were doing this and I were in charge of a diversity and inclusion program, which I'm sure I never will be, but if I were, I would just have people imagine various responses to each one of these points that's being made. I ended this, question and answer bit just arbitrarily. The fact is, this could have gone on for another 10 minutes. And I honestly don't have a side in this issue, in this question, because I just think there are lots of reasons to agree with Jamal, lots of reasons to agree with Rachel. So this conversation could have gone on for another 20 minutes. But, I stopped it, and I think where I did stop it is enough to illustrate the first point which I'd like to make, which is that all the diversity and inclusion programs that I know of strenuously avoid these kinds of questions, these kinds of exchanges, because if they didn't avoid them, I think it would become clear that diversity and inclusion isn't something that you can be quote unquote trained in. It's not something you can be trained in. To train someone in something, let's say like, CPR or basic automobile maintenance, it requires that there be a relatively stable object, as well as a stable body of knowledge and techniques that can be passed along to other people. But the fact is, there just isn't any such stable body of knowledge or techniques when it comes to diversity and inclusion. there are always going to be competing interests and trade-offs, always. So the only question is whether those interests and trade-offs are going to be acknowledged and whether they're going to be shoved under the rug. And I guarantee you, if it's called training, at least one competing interest will have to be shoved under the rug. And the interest that's going to be privileged, that's going to win, will always be the person who, at that particular moment, and by that particular moment, I mean, basically the month and year of the program, that the interest that will always be privileged will always be the person who, at that particular historical moment, is considered by the equity professionals to be on the top of the intersectional hierarchy. So I can update this, and we can see this pretty easily because that was from, I think, 2019 when I took that particular module. And I'm sure that it wouldn't play in the same way if we introduced another figure into this little scenario. But before I do that, let me show you. I want to share the screen here and show you an actual, let me see, an actual situation in which someone is, this actually happens in Norway a few years back.
Velkommen. Takk for det. Takk for at vi kunne komme. Hei. Hei. Det er greit. Super, bare hyggelig. Gleder deg på min side. Ja, interessant. Ok. Velkommen til Sylvi Listhaug og Fahad Qureshi. For 2 minutter siden så møttes dere i dette studioet. Dere tok hverandre ikke i hånda, men du fikk en blomsterkvast, Sylvi. Fortell hva som skjedde. Det var jo veldig hyggelig å få blomster, men det er klart i Norge det som er vanlig når vi treffer hverandre, det er jo håndhilse, og det registrerte jeg at du ikke ønsker å gjøre, og jeg har ikke fått noen forklaring på hvorfor det. Qureshi, kan du fortelle hva som skjedde? Jeg er helt enig med deg. I norsk sammenheng så er det veldig vanlig å håndhilse på hverandre. Og nettopp derfor, på grunn av religiøse årsaker, så foretrekker jeg også håndhilse på denne måten. Altså for å gjøre opp for det, så hadde jeg tatt med blomster for å vise at jeg faktisk setter pris på deg, verdsetter deg som et menneske. Men hva er grunnen til at dere ikke håndhilser? Alle andre jeg har på besøk her håndhilser. Så hva er grunnen? Det er bare på grunn av min religiøse overbevisning, så skal man helst ikke ha fysisk kontakt med det motsatte kjønn, fordi det er min kones rettighet overfor meg at jeg ikke skal ha noen som helst fysisk kontakt med noen andre enn henne. Listhaug, hva tenker du? Jeg tenker at det er jo litt sånn uforskammet i dagens Norge å ikke håndhilse på hverandre. Vi lever jo i et likestilt land, der jenter og damer har samme rettigheter som menn, der vi kan greie det samme og skal ha like muligheter. Og jeg tenker at når man har et sånt utgangspunkt, så legitimerer man jo det at jenter ikke får samme muligheter i Norge. Er det jeg som ikke får samme muligheter, for det er jeg som ikke fikk håndhilse på deg på grunn av min kones forespørsel til meg. Men Listhaug fikk heller ikke håndhilse på deg? Jeg fikk jo blomster. Sylvi Listhaug, Fahad Qureshi, tusen takk for at dere kom begge to.
Wow, interesting. So
Yeah.
tell me more.
So that's something, again, it went by fairly quickly, but one thing to point out is that this happened in 2017 and it went viral, but what went viral was not the video we just saw. What went viral was that scene, just the scene. And so it was clipped, taken out of context, and then shown, and people were obviously infuriated depending on which side they were on.
Right, depending on which side.
That's right, yeah. And when you actually see the video that they have produced here, it's actually much more interesting because you realize these are two legitimate points of view, I think, that, deserve to be heard, but nobody wants to do that. And I hasten to add that diversity, equity professionals, quote unquote, are also not interested in showing, I think, these kinds of questions, in part because they leave you, I think, really in a quandary about what you should do. And how do you train people to be comfortable in a quandary? That's what the training should consist of, but it doesn't. Training always involves telling people what the right answer is. And to that extent, it's always excluding something. And it's really one of the things it's excluding are diverse points of view, which is, of course, ironic given what these programs pretend to be doing. So we could just imagine, for example, that if we updated this from 2017 to 2022, and let's imagine we have the Muslim male being introduced to a trans male, that is, a biological female who identifies as male. And I'll call this trans male Chris. Well, what happens when the Muslim Jamal refuses to shake Chris's hand because Jamal doesn't believe that Chris is simply identifying as a man makes Chris a man? I guarantee you that this is not going to appear in a diversity and inclusion course because it brings to the fore the opposing interests of two quote unquote marginalized groups, the Muslim community on the one hand and the trans community on the other. So if you'll indulge me just one more time, we can imagine a conversation in the HR office between trans male Chris and the Muslim Jamal. So Chris says that not shaking my hand is a denial of my very existence as a man. And we can imagine that she cites Professor Chiara Bridges to make this point. And Chiara Bridges was recently appeared in the Senate in a question and answer session with Josh Hawley that went fairly viral. And Chiara Bridges is a professor at Berkeley, a professor of law. And she made the point that to Senator Hawley that even questioning the existence of a trans male person, or even raising any questions whatsoever, is an invitation to violence, and accused him in this Senate chamber, in the Senate meeting, of inviting violence against trans people. I just mentioned this to show you how seriously some people take the very idea of even questioning it. So, Jamal, how does Jamal respond to this? Seems to me he can easily say that the very idea of transphobia, or for that matter, homophobia, are themselves culturally determined pejoratives, but they're being deployed as if they're transcultural, transhistorical medical diagnoses. So it's in fact Eurocentric, Jamal says, and by extension, utterly xenophobic to require that a practicing Muslim who was born in Egypt agree to the idea that a person can change their sex or that there are more than two genders, which is contradicted by the Quran. So now we imagine what Chris's response is going to be to that. And one of the things Chris could say is that Islamophobia isn't a universal category either. In fact, the term has even been criticized within the Muslim community for its use as a weapon against reformers. Outside the Muslim community, in China, for example, is Islamophilia, that is, an affinity for Islam, and the Chinese actually use this term in translated fashion to describe what they consider a mental disorder. Now, Jamal then at that point objects strenuously and reminds Chris that China has used the label of Islamophilia to imprison perhaps 1 million or so Uyghur Muslims. At this point, in my imaginary scenario, the head of HR then warns Jamal against what she fears is his xenophobia. And she quotes from the University of Michigan Guide to Inclusive Classrooms, which says that instructors should avoid making invidious distinctions between the policies of Western governments and, for example, and I'm quoting here, social policies in China. Now, obviously, the complexity of this kind of conversation is always going to be left out of any diversity and inclusion programs that are currently available. And this allows me to make what I hope is an important point. And it's not that the talk of diversity and inclusion goes too far. It's not that. It's always that it never goes far enough. It never goes far enough. And when I say it doesn't go far enough, I mean it never goes far enough down into details, into distinctions. The kinds of details and distinctions you get when you have people like Jamal or Chris or Rachel countering statements, countering points of view with their own questions and distinctions. And this is what I think real diversity and inclusion training should consist of. Most diversity and inclusion programs stop, in other words, at what I'm going to call a highly pixelated version of social and historical reality. And the level of pixelization where diversity discourse always stops is utterly predictable. And it always stops at what the diversity bureaucrats call a community. And more often than not, they'll call it a marginalized community, the African American community, for example, or the Hispanic community, or the LGBTQ plus community, and so on. Now, I mention this to make another, what I hope is an important point, and it's this, that these communities are in fact fictions. They're projections. And they're projections for the most part of the college educated overclass who map onto these communities their own prejudicial views of what these communities are and what these communities believe and experience. And more often than not, these highly pixelated, made up communities are little more than generalized racial stereotypes. And this brings me to the second hackable diversity and inclusion resource, which has been the Magna Carta of diversity and inclusion programs for the last 15 years. And this is the 2007 essay entitled Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life, whose principal author is Teachers College professor Daryl Wing Su. So if you've been hearing about microaggressions, I'm taking you back to the very beginning, the original essay that got this whole thing started. And it's right at the center, at the foundation of all diversity and inclusion programs, not only in the United States, but in the Western world generally. So I just want to focus on one class of microaggressions, which Sue calls the tendency of white people to pathologize the communication styles of people of color. And I'm going to share a screen here. Here is this essay, Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life, published in 2007. And as you can see, Daryl Wing Su is the principal author, and I'll just be referring to him. And then there are 6, I think, co-authors, if you can believe it. And the first, and he sets out a series of tables. The first one, which I want to point to, is this one. And just to show you the categories that you'll be looking at, the theme here is on the left of the screen. The microaggression is, the statements that people make, and then the message that's sent, according to Professor Su and his co-authors, is over here on the right. So we can move down the page a little bit. And I just want to, again, I want to focus on this one issue, what he calls pathologizing the communication styles of people of color. And this is remarkable because he says here, asking a Black person, why do you have to be so loud, animated, just calm down? That's telling them to assimilate to the dominant culture. And then he says that asking an Asian person or a Latino person, why are you so quiet? We want you to know what you think. Be more verbal, speak up more, is sending the exact same message. That at least is his claim. So I think there are several things to point out here. The first is that when Sue is talking about Asian culture, he doesn't mention that he's talking about East Asian culture, which I think is what he means, which means he's talking about Koreans, Chinese, Japanese. And he imagines somehow that all these people speak more quietly than most white people. I think that's the unmistakable implication of this. That is, that they tend to be quieter, and Latino people seem to be quieter too. And this is just presumably something that's connected with being Asian. Now, here's the other thing that this essay, the other mistake the essay makes throughout, which is Sue and his co-authors remarkably confuse racial identity with ethnicity. So what he imagines is that one can simply see someone and judge by the maybe the color of their hair, the complexion of their skin, or the shape of their eyes, whether they're Asian or not only racially Asian, which is, an obvious point that one can make, an obvious conclusion one can draw. But the conclusion you can't draw is whether they are ethnically Asian. For example, an Asian child who is adopted by Jewish parents, who grows up in a Jewish household, or an African-American household for that matter, or an Italian household. There's nothing in them, nothing in their racial makeup that is going to produce anything resembling Asian ethnicity, if we could even understand that. So the idea that an Asian person simply on the basis of a racial makeup will speak quietly is, of course, racism pure and simple. The same goes for the Black person. Sue never makes any adjustments for whether the person is a Black person from South Central LA, the South Side of Chicago on the one hand, or from Ladera Hills in California, a very wealthy Black community, or indeed whether they're immigrants from Sudan, immigrants from Liberia, from South Africa. None of these distinctions register for Sue because he wants to imagine that all of these people have the same racial identity. Now, what's even more striking is the second table that I want you to look at, which is this one. And this is not only, this clarifies that this isn't just a judgment you make, but that you actually are supposed to act on these judgments. That is, you're supposed to treat individuals differently based on your assessment of what their race is. And this is where it gets just remarkably crazy. So we have the same problem over here on the left, but here he gives another example of the kind of thing you are not supposed to do. And there's also an implication about what you should do. And this is, again, something one wants to pay attention to. So you have a Black client who is loud, emotional, and confrontational in a counseling meeting. And remember, this is not what Sue says the white therapist says. He says, this is an objectively loud, emotional, and confrontational person in a counseling session. The therapist in Sue's cartoonish scenario diagnoses this Black lady with borderline personality disorder. Now, any therapist who makes that kind of quick judgment shouldn't be a therapist, but let's just go with it for a moment. What I find stunning is that what the implication of this is that a Black client who is loud, emotional, and confrontational, and to such an extent that a therapist, let's forget the fact that the therapist might think that the person has a borderline personality disorder, but let's assume that the therapist at the very least thinks this person is under some kind of emotional distress, and that's why the person presumably is seeing a counselor. What Sue actually implies here is that the person is just being Black. That is to say, that's the normal behavior for a Black person, to be loud, emotional, and confrontational. And to treat it as anything but that, as anything but a kind of standard mode of behavior for Black people, is to pathologize what he calls a cultural value and communication style of a Black person. I don't know what one says about this, except that it is textbook racism. And this isn't sort of some backhanded weird interpretation that allows you to get to racism. It is just on its face a racial judgment which allows you to treat people very differently based on nothing more than the color of their skin. And of course, let's just imagine what this could lead to. A therapist, sees somebody, this Black woman who is emotional and confrontational, and thinks momentarily that she's under real psychological pressure and experiencing real psychological distress. But then she recalls her diversity training session. She realizes, oh no, there's nothing wrong with her. She's just behaving like Black people do. So if this were an essay that just appeared somewhere and then was written off very quickly, it'd be one thing. But this is not that. It's an essay that has probably reached more college administrators, and from there, more undergraduate students than any single essay in the last 15 years. That's what makes this so very frightening. So if one were to use this in in a diversity training seminar, I would go, in fact, if I were running one, I would go right to this essay, in part because it's so influential. And I'd look at the many, many problems it has. And these are not minor issues, these are major issues. So, and I think just talking about, in fact, that essay and going into the charts and noticing how he is sort of typecasting and stereotyping behaviors as cultural values of particular racial groups. That would go a long way towards, I think, unpacking not only what the agenda is in the diversity and inclusion sort of industry, but also it wouldn't be just a matter of criticism. You could also go on from there and just begin asking questions about it. And in fact, engage in some real interesting conversations about all the things that kind of thing ignores. So unfortunately, these racial and in fact bigoted generalizations about populations tend to be the rule rather than the exception in every diversity and inclusion program that I've ever experienced. And I think just showing that, just taking these programs apart by asking basic questions would go a long way towards expanding people's idea about true diversity and what it means to be genuinely inclusive. Of course, it's difficult to know what questions to ask if you don't have, at least some knowledge of the subject matter, or at least some appreciation for how complicated these issues are likely to be. And this is going to bring me to my final point, which in my role as a college professor, I'm particularly passionate about. And it's this, that diversity and inclusion in the literal sense of those words, rather than the politicized sense of those words, are precisely what a liberal education has been and should be about. If we go back to that first scenario I mentioned in which a Muslim man declined a handshake, the more you know about the religious history of Islam on the one hand, and the struggle for women's rights on the other, the more complicated that whole interaction becomes. Likewise, in the microaggressions essay, the more you know about the complexity of what's referred to as Asian culture, the less likely you'll be able to make the kind of bigoted assumptions that Professor Su makes as he pretends to be training you about diversity and inclusion. Of course, this knowledge doesn't have to come from books or formal education or going to college or anything like that. Someone who has, traveled widely can obviously learn a great deal about just how diverse the world actually is by experiencing it firsthand. But the truth is, we don't even know that much about our fellow citizens, especially here in the United States. They're all around us, and yet they're often invisible, especially in diversity and inclusion programs, which are blinded, I think, by their own stereotypes and projections. Here again, a genuinely liberal education can, I think, open your eyes to those biases by showing you just how often your perceptions of people are likely to be mistaken because they're projections of prejudice, not perceptions of reality. So I'll end with just one small pointed example of this kind of projection, which will allow me to hack one more time the microaggressions essay. You'll remember in that essay, we're told that telling a person, I don't think I've actually mentioned this. I won't go back to the PDF, but I'll just tell you what's actually said there. In that essay, we're told that a person of color, if you tell a person of color that, quote, anyone can succeed in this society if they work hard enough, Sue tells you how that will be received by a person of color. They will receive it, says Sue, as a microaggression because it conveys the message that people of color are lazy and that their failures are often their own fault. Now, I don't doubt that that's a possibility. I don't even doubt that that's a possibility that the person saying it intends that, if not entirely, at least partially. But I also know that it's by no means necessary that that's the interpretation, and it probably won't even be received that way by many people. But here's the striking thing, and I didn't really quite realize this until I picked up a book called The Cultural Matrix, which is edited by Harvard Professor Orlando Patterson, published in 2014. And this book is a compilation of studies supervised by Patterson in which researchers went into inner cities and actually did extensive interviews with impoverished Black young people to try to find out what they actually believed and what their values actually were. And here, I do want to share the screen And I want to show you a particular passage that I thought was striking. This comes from a long section, which Patterson and his co-authors are talking about some of the political opinions of Black young people in inner cities. And again, he's looking at a particular socioeconomic strata. He calls them disconnected youth. These are young people between the ages of 14 and 24, and they're from, the most impoverished areas of major American cities. And so here's what Patterson writes. When President Obama, in his recent speech announcing his new Brother's Keeper policy initiative aimed at improving the lives of Black youth, when he stated that, quote, "It may be hard, but you have to reject the cynicism that says the circumstances of your birth and the lingering injustices of society define you and your future," he was saying something with which the great majority of Black youth are in complete agreement. It is mainly older middle class Black Americans and their social science allies who would find it hard to agree with him. When asked to evaluate the problems facing Black men, 92% of Black youth aged 18 to 24 say that, quote, "young Black men not taking education seriously enough is a big problem." Somewhat surprisingly, Black youth are more likely than white youth to say that Black men are to blame for their own problems. Now, I want to make an important point here. I'm not saying that the Black youth that Patterson and his fellow researchers have studied are right to shoulder this blame. It strikes me that they may be shouldering it too much. My only point is that they do shoulder it. And any program which ignores these kinds of facts, which pretends that its own projections are perceptions and that its own generalizations apply to individuals, it really can't legitimately claim to be interested in real diversity and real inclusion.
So, Lyell, I've got quite a few questions for you. Let me repeat what I think your hacks were, which I think are so incredibly valuable.
Yes.
So one of the things that you say is a hack in terms of the way D&I is done today, DEI, is they boil down complex and nuanced situations and flatten them into a singular reality.
Yes.
Would I have? Okay. The other thing that I would say that I took from you, so I took 3 big hacks. The other thing is generalizations, right? So when you were talking about microaggressions,
Yes.
and I think this is huge, that it assumes that every Black, white, brown, whatever is a monolith.
Yes.
And can be boiled down to a stereotype.
Yes.
And the third, and this is related to I think number 2, is that we have these identities that are group identities and that completely flatten the individual.
Yes, that's right.
And what you said, something that I value very much, like, because at Counterweight we also believe in diversity and inclusion.
Yes.
However, when you do those 3 hacks as you outlined, is it truly diversity and inclusion?
Yeah.
Because in so many ways, by denying complexity, by generalizing, and by grouping people together, there is like we it's the almost, and I believe you said this, so at the extent or at the expense of repeating what you said, we are actually doing the antithesis.
Yes.
Of diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely. And so maybe just to keep the nomenclature straight, what I'm calling, well, it actually works to call these hacks because these are hacks in the sense of really incompetent people who are doing this stuff, right? So the 3 things that you talked about, I think we could call them pixelations.
I like that word. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Pixelations. They generalize. But here's something kind of interesting, Jennifer. If it was an actual pixelation, see, pixelation is too kind of a word for what's happening. Because if you take a pixelation, if you know how this you know how this works, right? You take a certain,
Mhm.
a square millimeter of a picture, and then you average the color, and then you paint the whole little cube or the whole little section that average, right? But at least you are paying attention to the average. You're listening to all the little
Mm.
minute voices of shade there, and then you're averaging them. Pixelation, in a racial context, in the context of diversity and inclusion, doesn't even do that. A good example of this is when you sometimes hear, you certainly hear it on college campuses, people talking about the Latinx community, right? Well, that's a great example of a phony pixelation
Mm.
because 80% of Hispanic people reject the term Latinx. This is a
I've heard
projection
that.
of a term.
I've
You see what
heard
I mean?
that. Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's a term that's only used by you can do the math. Two out of five uh, Hispanics, or is approved of by 2 out of 5 or 1 out of 5. Um, so um, so pixelation is this process by which you simply take a group, and instead of going further into that group, right, and say, okay, we have a quote unquote black community, and going down at them is, well, what do they believe? It turns out they believe a variety of things. They're
Right.
no more homogenous than a white community is, no more
Right.
homogenous than an Asian community is. So one of the questions I always had is, why are they doing this? Is this ignorance on their part? I don't think it actually is. I think there's a political game that's being played here
Mm.
because the communities as they're described are always described in a particular way, and their beliefs are being and the beliefs that they're supposed to have just happen to coincide with the political beliefs of the people who are making these projections. I
Mhm.
mean, that to me is always a tell. So, for example, you would never get the idea that most Black Americans are socially conservative.
Mhm.
You would never get the idea. In fact, this is why it's so enlightening to pick up Orlando Patterson's book. I have it around here somewhere. I'm kind of looking for it. Uh, I was astonished when he was describing these inner city Black kids. Now, I went to school with Black kids. We played on sports teams. And I knew just firsthand that they had, a wide variety of views. But I have to admit, I was shocked to hear the fact that, for example, these inner city Black kids, when asked, um, are really appreciative of American values, both for good and for ill. Uh, they have a great respect for the military. At one point, Orlando Patterson says in an essay in the Harvard Gazette, they're more Americans than most Americans. That is, they stand up for American values. But you see, I think diversity and inclusion administrators can't abide that because they don't approve of those opinions. And I think the most important thing is that you look at these opinions and you don't really care about whether you approve of them. You're trying to get a beat on just how complex our fellow human beings are. And, that's what diversity and inclusion has to be about. If it's not about that, as you point out, then it's not worthy of the name.
Yeah, and you said something else, and I feel for HR professionals because this is, and I took a note. You said what we're not teaching is how to be comfortable in a quandary. I believe
Yes.
that might have even been an exact quote.
Yes.
And so, I mean, you gave the example of Jamal and Rachel and Heather,
Yeah.
and there is no room for that kind of complexity.
Yes.
And if I may even further, if I understood you correctly, and if I didn't, please correct me.
Yeah.
The way that we are flattening this complexity, the way we're simplifying this complexity is indeed so many ways racist because we aren't looking at these different values
Yes.
from a holistic view, but from just a singular lens.
Yeah.
And again, to not to overuse this word that flattens anything as us as individuals. And I have some sympathy for HR professionals because I mean they must that situation with Jamal. I mean, just to imagine that happening, you've got your Rachels and you've got your Jamals and
Yes.
What? Let me ask you this as my last question. With all
Yeah.
this complexity,
Yes.
is it even possible to implement a true diversity and inclusion? And if so, what would it look like? Would it look like critical thinking? Would it look
Mhm.
like the embrace of complexity and nuance? What could HR professionals do that would embrace everything you just said?
Yeah. Well, so here is a let me go back to the problem they're facing, and which you are very sympathetic with. The problem they're facing is they need a company that functions smoothly. The fewer questions, the fewer conflicts, the better, right? so so this is sort of the problem with the HR departments, because they are primarily interested in making sure that everybody keeps their head down, don't raise any difficult questions, and don't have any conflicts, because conflicts don't make them money. What makes them money is smooth operation, right? So everybody needs to get in line and obey. Well, okay, so maybe there's room for that in a company. I totally disagree with it. I wouldn't want to work in a company like that. But what about a university? University is the opposite of that. So an HR professional at a university is in a dicey situation, because in a university, its job, this is what the industry of a university is, to keep questions open, to make sure that you don't try to resolve issues by simply saying, okay, your interest has to take a back seat and your interest is going to be privileged. You have constantly to remind people that you have to go back to the beginning of your question, how you live with a quandary. And this is why freedom of speech is so crucial. It's why it's so vital.
Mm-hmm.
The more diverse your nation becomes, the more diverse your institution becomes, the more vital freedom of speech is. Now, we don't always have to, it's hard to know what to do about Jamal refusing to shake somebody's hand. But what about Jamal when he has to, for example, agree to the idea that people can simply change their genders according to how they identify? I don't know how to resolve that in a university. But I do think that Jamal ought to be able to say, no, I don't believe people can change um, their gender simply by identifying. And I think there ought to be room for people to say, on the other side, that seems to me deeply transphobic. I don't approve of the term transphobic because it seems to medicalize a position, an idea, right? So I would prefer we not use that term. But nevertheless, the key is you've got to show Jamal and, let's say, Chris, who was the trans man that I posited, that neither of them can trump the other in this case. And the only way you do that is to insist that the conversation continue, and that to let them know that there's never necessarily going to be a resolution to the question in which both parties will be satisfied. We somehow have in the back of our heads that all of these questions have answers and that they're going to be satisfactory to everybody, and they won't be.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a civil society, not to say at a corporation, which is a different thing, as you suggested, but in a civil society and in a university, which I think has to be the center of this civil society, you have to allow people to differ and to insist that they do so in words rather than violence, and to make that distinction between words and violence crystal clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, that's a lot to I love the stories and the analogies and the anecdotes that you gave, because it really brought to light a lot of the things that we struggle with, but we don't actually put into something that we can visualize, and you did that for us.
Yeah. Well, it's part of what literature is. I mean, I think it's probably why I went into literature. I think we all love individuals. We love stories,
Right.
actual things that actually happen. And the thing about literature is the more you're involved in it, everybody knows this. If you're reading Tolstoy or Shakespeare or Jane Austen, all these people, Brontes, um, it's constantly showing you just how wrong you are. So the thing you learn from literature is not confidence, but humility.
Ah.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
what
so
you
I
learn.
just and I just had a light bulb moment when you're talking about literature, and I know that's your passion. If we are to do D&I, I think maybe the answer is the storytelling, right?
Yes,
And that storytelling so that people see that we are more than an
yes,
avatar,
yes.
more than a generalization, more than a stereotype. And so in some ways, to the extent that you even have D&I wonder if it's just not like a program, if you will, that gets to know everyone as the individual.
Yeah, people telling stories. Now, again, at a university, you're going to get particular kinds of stories because people are sort of prompted to tell particular stories. But the kind of stories that I would like to hear are the ones in which students, I think, unfortunately, are afraid to admit to,
Mm,
which is that, for example, you can be Black and grow up in an upper middle class neighborhood and have no
mm,
connection to inner cities any more than a white person has who is at most colleges and universities has any connection to Appalachia. They don't know anything about
right,
white people in Appalachia, and there are plenty of
right.
Black people who know nothing about what it's like to live in the inner city. And this is
I
this
would
is
even most Black people would say that they have
yes,
not. No,
absolutely,
yes,
absolutely. But
right. But we've stereotyped. I mean, which
what you
again is
said
the
is
most.
that we imagine that
Mhm,
everybody does because we
mhm,
imagine we've actually, if you do studies, you find out that especially college age people overestimate the number of Black folks, our Black fellow
mhm,
Americans living in poverty because they've been sold this image of what Black culture is.
mhm,
But the last thing I'll say, that the thing about storytelling is exactly right. And fortunately, you don't have to go to a university to get that. Now, by virtue of YouTube, I don't know if you're familiar with the series Soft White Underbelly.
mm-mm.
Oh my gosh, just go. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's got a huge following, and deservedly so, because he goes to
Okay.
places all around the country, Appalachia, uh,
I've seen. Oh, I think I know
L-
what you're talking about.
LA.
Yes.
He goes down to uh, some of the most crime-ridden
Mm,
and drug-ridden sections of LA and San Francisco, and
mhm,
actually talks to people. It is amazing how the pictures that we have, and you don't think they're pixelated because you have them. And then all you
mm,
have to do is listen to three people from the same area, and you realize I have no idea who these people were until I heard them talk.
mm.
And that's the kind of thing that we have to inculcate an appreciation for, I think.
Yeah. Amen. I agree. Lyle, thank you for sharing your insights. This is and your hacks.
Yes. So you can go and hack into every DEI program and make a good one out of it.